Hello adventurers and welcome back to my channel. Today we are at the Buffalo Bill Center and we are going through the Plains Indian Museum. This is a unique attraction that you will want to check out to learn a little bit of the context and history not only of this area but of Wyoming in general. This is going to be great. You're coming with me? Let's go. Now here it does a little bit of explaining of what we're about to see, but also answers a question that so many of us have. Indian, Native American, First People, Indigenous, or First Nation? What is the most accurate and respectful term to use? And it says that we will see each of these regarded in the exhibitions and all are considered to be acceptable. And many people prefer to be referred to by their specific tribe, and the term Native American became common in the 1960s and 70s through laws that covered Indigenous people in the United States, but there is not a single preferred word. Because context matters, I wanted to share that with you today. So as we go through each of these exhibits, we can learn a little bit more about all of the people, but also we can term them correctly. Because I know there's a lot of controversy that stirs in some of my more historic videos as to what to call the people themselves. And if we do not have a proper tribe, any of those are substantial according to this. Now, this particular museum is pretty interesting because they have worked in conjunction with several of the tribes. So some of the items we can see here are from them directly. And I think that that's absolutely fabulous, but there is a lot to explore today. And I cannot wait to share this with you. It is going to be an exceptional and beautiful look into the past, but also is going to tackle some of the more interesting subject matters. So today, buckle up, we're in for a ride, but first let me show you around. We begin our journey today with the land of many gifts. And there is a quote here that says, "We women had our children to care for, meat to cook and dry, robes to dress, skins to tan, clothes, lodges, and moccasins to make. We not only pitched the lodges, but we took them down and we packed the horses and the travois. And when we moved camp, we were busy, especially when we were going to move. I love to move. Even after I was a married woman with children to take care of, moving made me happy." And this was a quote by the woman featured in this. Her name is Pretty Shield, and she was a Crow from 1932. But inside this gallery, not only will you find larger items like this with quotes, but you'll find contemporary voices with art and also more traditional looking items. We find many of the styles of beadwork and fashion. We find several explainers as to why they use the various materials. And as we go about, there are a series of signs like these that help us to better embrace and understand the various things that we are seeing. So with that said, it is time for our tour to begin. We begin our journey with more about the Crow people. And it says Crow lodges are constructed around 4 main poles. And after the 1880s, when the traditional bison hide became less available, they switched to canvas for lodge covers. As you can see, they were able to roll the side of the lodge for summers to allow in more airflow and cool the interior. And they layered hides on the floor in order to have more heat during the winter time and make it more comfortable throughout the various seasons. As we started off with the quote, we noticed that the women were in charge of a lot of different things, but as a whole, many of the tribes were super nomadic and enjoyed the movement because it brought them to various food systems. And as we go through the collected amount of work here that we can learn from, you can gather more information about the nomadic lifestyle, but also through the cases, we can see some of the items that they might have used. In fact, this particular section mentions that many tribes had women who contributed to their families' diets and also the trade economy. And so you can see here some of the things that women primarily would have harvested. And they have something called a burden basket in this section also. And through these, they would collect the items. And there are some additional quotes as to what this job would have been like. Now, traditionally, we have familiarized ourselves throughout our American history with the act of corn, rice, and beans in the economy and how it has changed the way that we have food staples. And if you've listened to many of the stories from when the Pilgrims were here, we learned that the indigenous people taught them how to plant these things because they were unfamiliar. However, here you can find various types of corn that were synonymous with many of the tribes themselves. Corn was a major staple because it could be used in so many different ways. They could use the husks, they could use the actual corn itself, and they could use the cobs. And much like when they hunted bison, they chose to use every single piece and not waste. And that's one of the things that we can definitely learn from all of the tribes, is that they did not take things for granted. And as we move through here, we'll see more of that reflected. But the story here is vast, and this gallery is huge. So let's get to a few new facts. When it comes to children, every single adult in the tribe had a purpose within the child's development. From the grandparents, who were especially important because they cared for the children and they made them toys, to the parents directly teaching them skills. They were all affiliated, and the phrase, "it takes a village to raise a child," truly was reflected within the indigenous culture and people, and still is today. Here on display there are some beautiful beaded yokes and dresses, and this was actually one from the Lakota, which was a northern plains tribe, and still to this day is reflected through many of the beautiful beadwork. Now these beads that they're using create patterns that tell stories based on various ceremonies, based on where they are located, and this was a tedious task. These beads are very tiny. In fact, you can see there are thousands upon thousands of beads in each one of these particular outfits or these particular ceremonial garments. As we move into this section, we learn about the Cheyenne migration, and we see here what that might have looked like on horse with these small sticks coming out the end that might be like a trailer for them. They have everything that has to be attached to them or to the horse in order to go from place to place. And there were some of the native people who would also walk alongside in many cases. Now, looking on at this, you can see again the beautiful beadwork, but also what the regalia might have looked like and what kind of items that they took with them. But I thought it was very interesting that they also made a choice here in the museum to not portray them as a specific skin type, because just like so many groups today, we know not everyone is the same color. And they didn't want to limit and isolate the story of what was happening to just that and get fixed on that detail. So instead they made them more neutral so that you can envision what it would have been like and not necessarily just personify one group, because in all reality many of the groups of tribes would have to move in a very similar nature. And I think that that's pretty fascinating that they chose to do that, but also it does allow you to kind of visualize and paint the picture and see the information for what it is versus typecasting it to one specific. Does that make sense? Here we learned, though, that the night before a move, the women would pack all of the family belongings, and then after breakfast, the women took down and packed all the teepee covers, the backrest, the bedding, and the furnishings. And then they would get it all set up so that they could hit the road like this. Now, the women were, as always, the backbone of the community of the indigenous, and many times they were regarded by the men as such. They knew the impact that they had in the community. They knew that they were strong, and despite the fact that many of the women never became chiefs, they were considered to be some of the most powerful people within the tribal structure, because without them they could not exist. Now in the second portrayal, you'll see that there is actually a dog here, and believe it or not, dogs have served as guardians, hunters, and companions for Native people for thousands of years. Not to mention they were hunting companions in many of the tribal hunters. A large dog could be used not only as all of those things, but whenever they would move, it could haul up to 75 pounds itself. So normally it had a caretaker that would walk alongside it, usually a child or a woman, and it would carry a portion of the belongings as well and follow alongside its counterparts as they moved up. Now we learned that scouts would actually lead the way for the traveling bands, and they would would scan the landscape for signs of wild game or enemies. And the group was protected on both sides by warriors, which would carry their weapons. And you can see here, this is one Cheyenne man wearing a headdress and holding a shield. And this was somewhere between 1922 and 1935. All of the signs here not only have historic photos, context to what we're seeing, but also interesting facts about the display. This museum space has created a wonderful opportunity for you to learn, but also to interact with each piece of the content. And there's something here for everyone, from the very small to the very tall and everything in between. And I think that that's pretty incredible. There's so much emphasis on each of these points. There are some beautiful galleries ahead, however, so let's get moving. For all Plains Indian people, the buffalo was the center of their economic and cultural as well as spiritual practices, and tribes preserved their spiritual connection to the buffalo through prayer and rituals. Anyone wearing a horned bonnet communicated with the buffalo directly and was said to have special powers related to the animal, which was given to them through their visions and dreams. Now, we spoke extensively at the beginning of this exhibit as to the women of the tribes and how they were the backbone, but what were the men? The men were the warriors. They were also the storytellers. And here we can find a little bit of information about what the men would do and how that they would convey these messages. In fact, here, art was an integral part of the men's lives as warriors, and the visionary experience prepared men for war, as it inspired the designs on their shields, which we can see here. And they would use pictographs such as land, streams, animals, and plants on these. They would also record their exploits of war and hunting through tribal events, including art and oral narratives. And here we can see pieces of what that would have looked like on a larger scale and also a smaller one. Now, a war lodge was an area where warriors would travel through the enemy country, and they would build war lodges in heavily wooded areas. And the war lodge that you're seeing in front of me kind of gives you an idea as to what that looks like. Lodges were constructed from timbers, and then they were covered with bark or brush to provide a shelter. And also they could conceal a small fire that was built within. And they were a little bit smaller than the regular domicile houses usually, because they were there for a very specific purpose. War lodges were not occupied by women. They were a male thing, and they were part of the traditional pre-planning and preparing for what was to come. And I think that it's very interesting to see the difference between the two homes that we've seen thus far. And then there's a whole lot more. So this is telling the story to us piece by piece and unfolding it like an onion. And of course, various tribes had different kinds of cultural significance and variations of these things. But there were some common threads. The lack of wastefulness, and then the resourcefulness within the communities of using what they had when it came to like the bison and things like that, traveled across the board from tribe to tribe. In fact, as we learn about the buffalo and the people, there was another amazing quote here. The great herd running away, the buffalo running, their drumming hooves send dust clouds billowing into the sky, and the promise of good hunting. The buffalo and her child approaching, mother and calf coming, turn back from the herd, promise abundance. And this is from a Pawnee song. Moving through these three galleries, we learn more about trade, horses, and again, migration. And alongside the migration, we find some more historic photos and some of the items that they might have had that they would take along with them. Most of the tribes moved seasonally, and here you can learn more stories of migration and seasonal mobility, as well as answering some of the more common questions that they have for us that might come up. And I think that between the displays and then also the additional reading, this is a great way for you to really encompass the theme of each one of these, but also to again be able to see some of these items up close and personal, and then through each one of these signs learn where exactly they came from. And each tribe is credited, each individual is credited, and then also a brief descriptor of the item itself. Of course, within migration, horses made a major difference in that the Plains Indians were introduced to the horses in the 17th century, and they were quickly introduced into every single aspect of existence, including the travel. But they were also helpful because they became an important source of wealth and prestige. And in this case, we can find some of the various beadwork that has been done specifically for horses. You can also see how horses were reflected in petroglyphs, and they were considered to be incorporated into their tribe also in a spiritual way. The special connection between the first people and horses is just incredible. In fact, if you see even today the bond that many people have within the communities with horses, it is just next level. It's very interesting. I recently saw something of a woman who worked within her tribe with horses, and the connection that each horse had with her, that she'd just walk up and they would bow their heads, and it's a sign of mutual respect between the person and also the animal. And that's something that was effectively shown throughout the entire time of the interactions with the indigenous people, and I think that that is just incredible. Of course, as we move into trade, we are asking what items were traded amongst the Plain Indian tribes and the Europeans, and the vast coast-to-coast network existed prior to the colonization, and they were exchanging raw materials such as hides and elk teeth, hair pipes, shells, pretty much anything that they could source they were using, and they were trading it for items that could be beneficial to the tribe as a whole. And as we move through this section, you can see some of the patterns of exchange information. And it says here that since the ancient times, they have always been a trading group. And throughout the different locations that we have been to, this is a sentiment that has been echoed time and time again. In fact, before colonization really moved into these areas, there were traders who were coming through these regions who had a great connection with the tribes. And they would trade things that they had for things that they wanted, and vice versa. And this was a through line of communication that wasn't rocky, that wasn't violent, and many times it was really a great connection for both sides. Colonization changed everything because it brought violence to the people that normally would not be violent people. And so throughout time, trade has been something that they've always heavily relied on. And as that bumpy road began with the colonization, some of that trade started to transfer from just basic items to services and pieces of firearms and equipment, because it was a necessity. Now here we move into a couple of different galleries. They have a balcony level and a lower level. Check out this incredible room. This place is huge. It's the size of a movie theater. And as you can see, it depicts the setting of where a tribe might have been, a sunset, and then the rocky crags around, which are very similar to that of this region. There is a floor here kind of in the middle, and then one on the bottom. We're going to start by going through here and then working our way down. Now, if you happen to be coming to the Buffalo Bill Center, there are several museums within the larger conglomerative museum, and because of that, you're going to need time. A single entry for an adult is $23, but that gets you 2 days worth of entry, so you can go to each of the galleries and take your time so you don't have to feel rushed moving through them. I came yesterday to go check out the Buffalo Bill Museum as well as the Draper Museum, and I came back today because there's just so much information. This is definitely a must-see if you're in Cody. In this middle case right here, we learn about all of the different people, and there are a few little maps in here to tell us about the location. But first, it tells us that the history of the people is not defined by geographic boundaries. For example, the Shoshone people have lived in this region for over 12,000 years, but based on treaties, boundaries were changed. Based on broken treaties, boundaries again were changed. And as time has passed, it has continued to be something that has evolved. I hear something. What is it? Let's go check it out.
The sun is the greatest of those things the Creator has given to us. In the morning, we always make an offering to the sun that comes up.
This is incredible. It tells you stories, and in addition to the story that it tells, there is actually an area that you can go and look at the closed captioning. So if you can't hear it correctly, or you're not understanding it, or you need that assistance moment, they do have that available. I think it is so imperative that you find one of these benches when you hear that sound go off and just watch. So much context, but also so many words from the actual native people. And I think that that is just phenomenal. But with that said, let us return to what we were talking about with the Wind River Reservation, where we learned that the Shoshone were there because of various treaties and then breaking of those treaties, but they were not alone. The Arapaho were actually not granted any land in a very important treaty, which was Fort Laramie. and instead they were moved onto the Wind River Reservation as well, which brings us to our next point. A lot of these people were used to living kind of isolated from one another. They didn't necessarily mesh together all of the time, and wherever they did, sometimes that had conflict, sometimes it did not. But through these treaties, they basically thrust people into a postage stamp of land and said, okay, that's it, you stay there. For nomadic people, it was definitely an adjustment. It was an adjustment that did not always go well. And so the Arapaho and the Shoshone would then live together and find ways to coexist and to self-govern within that small space, a very small space that they now had to share. This section we learn about living in the highlands of the plains, and this includes the Wind River Range, the Black Hills, the Bighorn Mountain, and also the Beartooth area. Each one of these cases has a bit of context as to where each of these were located, but also items that have been found or shared from those regions. Using the Bighorn Mountains as an example, you can find many items that were donated from the people in those areas. But you can also find a few historic facts, such as the Bighorn Mountains were named for the cow origin story, which was the 7 sacred rams, and they represented the constellations of the Big Dipper. And the eldest ram, Big Metal, and his ram brothers saved children from a cliff after being pushed by a jealous father. And that's why we see this piece right here. There's also a map that shows you the elevation change throughout this area and where this would be located. The Bighorn Mountains go from Wyoming into Montana just a tiny, tiny bit. And of course, in this case, we can see the storage bags and what is apparently a sword cover. And so each of these are beaded with those tiny little beads. They're absolutely elaborate and beautiful. And this is what each case has to offer, a little bit of information about each of these regions. For example, the Black Hills is a border between Wyoming and South Dakota. And here we find a water vessel that was made from an animal horn, a spoon that was made from a buffalo horn. There are some arm cuffs, which are tanned hide, and then porcupine quills. And then they also have some leggings, which were tanned deer hide, and then they used glass beads. And it says on the leggings, celestial bodies hold deep cultural meaning to the Arapaho who were in this area. And they're depicted in their art, such as the sun motif in these. Now, the Black Hills area encompasses Devil's Tower, which I've been to and hiked before, and it was of significance to them culturally as well as ceremonially. And you can find all of that in this section. I'm going to leave some of this for you guys because there's a lot of information we still have to cover throughout the museum, but this is fascinating and really gives you a look at who the people were in each section of these areas, and then also how there were similarities as well as differences. Now, off to each side of the lower level, you will find art galleries. On this one, Native Arts Today Gallery, and this one is newer to the museum itself. This has portraits that face past and present, as well as material culture and the power of place, and also something kind of fascinating right here. Now, most of the art in this section is all newer, so you can see modern interpretations of various things. This, for example, was 2 students from one of the Indian schools in Ashland, Montana. They created Van sneakers, and those Van sneakers express various themes within the culture, and then also are just brilliant with the use of color and style. This piece is a mixed media acrylic on canvas from 2001. It's called An Early Indian Rodeo, and it's by Arthur Eminote, I believe is how you say his last name. But you can see it has various layers and styles to this one. Art is very subjective, but I always enjoy taking it in and seeing what I can receive from it. I mentioned before, art is going to be subjective to each individual who's consuming it. Not every piece is going to speak to every person, but when you find something, it really pulls you in and really speaks. This is called Morning Star by Ramona Starr, a Hopi tribe member. In 1983, this is a dyed wool cotton thread, and it is a contemporary Hopi weaving, basically. She is an artist who's known for her weaving skills, which echo the traditional styles of the Pueblo techniques. But this is a modern blanket. So you can see how throughout time, some of those styles are still reflected in each and every tiny little piece of this blanket, very similar to her ancestors. I wanted to get back to these before we head out of this gallery. And these are taken from portraits of two individuals. This man right here, who was Irvin Little Plume, he was a Blackfeet tribal member. This photo was taken sometime between 1925 and 1940, and then you can see it is reflected here on this particular bag. And this is an artist adaptation of a Blackfeet design, and it's considered to be an illusionary pictorial beadwork. So this is all beads. Every single piece of this is beadwork. And then here we also have a little woman from the Blackfeet, and you can see her portrait and then the elaborate beadwork that went into this as well. I think this is incredible. The elaborate nature of the beadwork just throughout time has been incredible, but to see it now being fashioned into designs of portraiture is what? So incredible. Whereas previously, indigenous cultures might have used it to symbolically say this is a sun or this is an animal. They're now taking actual photos and turning them into something absolutely awesome. Just opposite of that gallery, we have the Buffalo culture era, and it shows many items that have been made by the good old bison. Here you can find various shirts, and as we kind of explore around the cases, you'll notice each one of them is very different. Some have horsehair attached, others have beadwork, still others have furs. It is just amazing to see the level of detail on each of these and how vastly different they truly are. This is a painted buffalo robe from approximately 1870. Plains Indian men needed a bow case and quiver to carry their weapons, and that way they could use them for warfare and hunting. Cases utilized otter hide, wool cloth, glass beads, tanned hide, bones, sometimes snakeskin. Believe it or not, they did actually have games. This is a ball and hoop game that originates in the 19th century, the early 19th century. Child's dress was from the Crow people from around the 1890s. We have now made it to the balcony level, and there is this large room. It's kind of dark. Not sure what this is. We're about to find out. But inside here we go to find out more. The video provided in here is truly touching. It's several people's accounts of their actual history. It is in the round, so pull up a seat and just enjoy listening to their actual voices telling the stories of their people. It is definitely moving, and I am very happy that this exists for us all. Now, the building that we just went into mimicked one of these earthen lodges. And I wanted to go ahead and go inside to get the context of the building itself before explaining a bit more about this particular lodge. One group of people lived in the earthen lodge villages along the Missouri River. Their gardens grew with corn and beans and squash and tobacco, and they hunted buffalo, and they established their villages as trade centers in the Great Plains. And around the fire, they would have celebrations of different ceremonies. They would seek shelter, and they would rejoice together and join. And here at the Buffalo Bill Center, they have this lodge so we can better understand what this is like and how that the community would have been brought into each of these and what resource they would have been. In the video, it does mention at one point, we no longer live in earthen lodges. We now live in homes. And that brings me to my next section of the museum, where there is a home. And it says we now live in a house. And I think that this is the transition into the more modern indigenous and their stories now, as we can see how the evolution changed from lodges, teepees, to more contemporary structures. And life changed dramatically at this point. In fact, here, when the Plains Indians were assigned to reservations in the late 1800s, they were expected to settle on single family plots. Men were urged to farm, women were taught to keep house, and they were supposed to follow Euro-American standards. And the communal camp life and ceremonies were discouraged and in some cases even banned. So you can see what this modern family, Standing Bear, as well as Rose Two Bonnets, Lula Two Bonnets, and Louisa Standing Bear of the Lakota tribe looked like in 1919 in this new home setting that they were forced into. Now, inside the home, all of these items have been curated to reflect the time frame as well as things that people might have used. But overhead, there is a voice that is talking. It's very hard to hear on camera, but it's telling the story of what life in the home might have looked like. And also, as you walk around, if you cannot again hear it as well, there is a closed captioning right here that allows you to better understand what is being said so that you can really soak it in. The accessibility here is fabulous, and I'm so happy that they have taken this time to make this detail. We learn here that fairs, powwows, and community gatherings bring on parades, processions, and they're rooted in the culture of hunting and migratory people. Among nomadic tribes, such as the Crow, and pre-reservation economy depended on organizations and their mobility. So having a parade echoes the mobility portion of their culture, and through the pageantry of the design, they're able to express their tribal values and speak to the growing population of today's society. Much like the gallery downstairs, which shows more contemporary art, there is a reservation art in this section that talks a little bit more about traditions and how that they would transition. Beginning in the 1870s, the Plains Indians were denied access to their ancestral lands, and they were dislodged, and they were given Christian ideologies, but they still managed to sustain culture through their elaborate beadwork patterns, which expressed things that were important to their particular culture. And on the reservation, despite all of those limitations, they were still able to express themselves. And this is something that continues to this day throughout the reservation art. Most of us will never understand what it is to have something that is so deeply embedded in who we are just taken away from us. Most of us will never be told that we cannot listen to the music that we like or celebrate birthdays the way that we do. That's just not something that happens. But for an entire group of people, they were told, it doesn't really matter if that's what you've been doing for thousands of years. We don't want you to do that. And then they were forced into very, very small pieces of land, and then they were told basically, give up everything. Can you imagine if someone walked up to you and said, I know that you've been living your life the way you have, but you can't do that anymore. I don't feel as though it would go well for most of us if that was the case. But that's exactly what happened to the Native people. And because of that, coming to places like this gives us a better perspective as to what that would be like and how that, even through it all, they have persisted and shown the amazing culture that they have. They were the first people who were here, but we told them they couldn't just be. But this museum proves that, yes, they can. In fact, here we learn education and heritage, and today's tribal education programs share their commitment to self-determination, honoring their community's traditional values, and then also the present needs of living in today's society. Around this, you can see many photos focusing on cultural identity as well as academic achievement and technical skills. And these programs have allowed students to go and thrive while also representing who they are significantly in the world today. See, education wasn't always something that was a positive place for the first people. They were not necessarily regarded in the highest of standards when it came to education because they had a way of life that would educate them as to the things they needed to do. But then again, when colonization came along, they swooped up the children and took them off to residential schools and separated them from their families in a hope to eradicate the people. In all reality, a lot of really terrible things happened to those students. And I've gone to many places which have spoken about this and the negative impact that that has had However, here they're celebrating the positive impact of the people in this gallery, and I am so excited because it just shows you that through determination and persistence, people can do amazing things, even when the odds are stacked against them. And the indigenous cultures and all of the tribes that we're seeing here are just absolutely a statement toward the bigger picture of preservation and caring and community. And so as we move about this gallery, it's just echoing itself over and over and over. And I am so happy that this place exists. Now here again, something else to get people involved. They have a scavenger hunt. And if you go around the scavenger hunt, you just grab one of these pieces and then you go and you look for these items. And when you find it, you can find the gallery guard and you receive a prize. So this is a great way to, again, get involved and look at some of the more intricate details of the galleries. I think this is great. Now, as we move along this wall, there is a timeline of events, which I really want to draw your attention to. There are a few displays here, some historic photos, and also some literature, but I think that this timeline best summarizes the experience of many of the people of this region. As you can imagine, there are several pieces of this timeline that are not going to be the most pleasant to read about or experience, but I think it's super important that we factually look at history so that we can learn from the past to make a better tomorrow. Today's adventure path is all about brain wrinkles and bettering ourselves through knowledge. And so as we move through this, brace yourself. Some of this is going to be kind of hard. The timeline, of course, begins with trade, which we've somewhat talked about previously. Even before colonization, the indigenous people were in the process of trading with others. And here you can find some of the various items that they may have traded for, including items from British, French, and American colonists over time. In fact, some of these items are quite elaborate, very nice. Unfortunately, as more people come, they bring in disease. And unfortunately, as a result of that disease, many of those who were in the tribes were affected by this. It wiped out entire groups of people, and it made it very difficult for so many just to be able to do basic things because these diseases were coming from other places. They'd never encountered some of these things before. And time again, we've learned about how many lost their lives and perished as a result of Northern or European diseases. June 19th, 1837. A group of fur traders came up the Missouri, and within only a short time, over 10,000 perished as a result of smallpox. They didn't have any vaccines like we do today. They didn't have the modern medicines. They only had the things that they had, and many of those things worked well for other stuff. But smallpox was something they'd never seen before, and it decimated so many people. Shortly thereafter, missionaries came, and they translated their works into languages such as the Dakota language. In fact, this Protestant and Catholic missionary traveled to the plains and promoted Christianity, and they used Bibles and hymnals in order to convert new members. Some people converted because they wanted to. Others kind of felt like they were pressured into doing so. And then the more that they were pressured, the more they were told they couldn't use their typical ceremonies because it was not Christian. You can see where this becomes a problem. By 1851, they were entering into warfare. And as you can see here, there was a treaty that defined the territories for the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and then others. And they were recognized by the U.S. government as such, and they were told that they were going to build forts and be given annuities, and they were going to build roads, and they were going to make sure everything was just hunky-dory. But clearly it was not. By 1862, the Homestead Act passed, and everything that they had promised over here with this treaty just started to kind of go out the window. They were encouraging settlement even in the Indian lands, and they were granting 160-acre tracts to anyone who wanted to go there for only $1.25 an acre. And here you can see the Northern Pacific Railroad traveling through the tribal land in Montana off to take away some of the lands from some of the people. This group right here, they were Plains delegations that traveled to Washington to try to use diplomacy as opposed to violence to defend their lands and the tribal interests. And beginning in 1870, whenever they had the Fort Laramie Treaty, Red Cloud made a dozen or more trips, in addition to some of these other gentlemen right here. When things did not proceed accordingly, then hunters came in and ravaged the land. At one point, killing over 40,000 bison, leaving the meat to rot. As you can imagine, this did not bode well, but their goal was to hunt out the very resource that the indigenous were using in order to get them to leave or die. They really didn't care about them. They were disposable humans in their opinion. Much so that then they started to raid camps of otherwise peaceful people. In fact, I've been to a place in Oklahoma where they swept in the night and killed women, children. They did horrible things. And these people were in their space, doing nothing. Absolutely nothing. A lot of times whenever we look at history, we see the black hat, white hat theory. The white hat is the good guy, the black hat is the bad guy. The indigenous person is always either the sidekick or the bad guy who's raiding. But in all reality, that was a projection that was created by Hollywood. And in doing so, they wanted to villainize the people that typically were in the most susceptible category to really bad things happening. In fact, many of the stories that I have found along the way at the historic sites have proven time and time again that as colonization moved in, as the Homestead Act continued to push forward, more and more indigenous lives were taken, most of the time in the night. Most of the time the women and the children. We tend to repeat history, so this is a point that we should learn. If you're in a community of people and you're a woman or a child, you should take note of history, because we are always the ones who get the most blowback when it's a really bad situation. And we can learn that from this story, but there's a little bit more. We move into reservations, and first beef issue at Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. All the buffalo were gone, and now people were forced to depend upon rations by the government. The very government who was coming in and murdering them in their sleep. The very government who overhunted the buffalo to get rid of their food supply. Because in all reality, the reservations weren't just about finding a peaceful way to exist, they were about pushing people into a small space so that they could be controlled. Which led to 1876, where a battle of greasy grass, Little Bighorn, involved the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and Sitting Bull himself, as well as Crazy Horse. And they defeated George A. Custer's cavalry. Custer and over 260 of his men were killed. Why is this important? Well, because Custer was actually the one who dictated many of those raids on women and children. And despite the fact that many of the tribal leaders would go and try to have a rational conversation in Washington with the powers that be, they just continued to murder people. And so at some point, they gave up on the peaceful talks and turned to violence. And in doing so, they eradicated the very guy who was causing much of their issue. And we now know that as a huge altercation. Now, depending on where you are, this story is told with reverence. This is also told in a very negative look in some capacities. But in all reality, this is something that happened that was a tipping point. And so frequently, because we don't have all of the context for all the details in all the places, it's harder to see that. I definitely encourage you to follow all of the steps in what happened with Custer. Despite the fact that Custer still has a state park named after him, I really changed my personal perspective of the man once I found out that he raided a place in Oklahoma and killed off children and women, and also did terrible things to the women. And this isn't up for debate. It factually happened. And unfortunately, these are the realities of our past, which is why I always say we need to learn from them so we don't make the same mistakes. Then we have the boarding schools, which we spoke about a little bit while ago, but these are some of the photos of the boarding schools themselves. You'll notice these children are very small. They were taken from their families and told that they had to go to these places. And commencement programs from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School of 1906 are actually featured right here. Boarding schools were established throughout the United States to assimilate people into a civilized world. The problem with this is that they were removed unsupervised from their communities and all influences, and a lot of times they were neglected, and in many, many cases, really terrible things happened. If a child fell ill, they may or may not have good health care for them. In Canada, as well as the United States, they have found random children that were at these tribal schools that perished and were never even explained to their families what happened in many cases. These schools were very strict. A lot of times they resulted in a lot of corporal punishment, starvation techniques, basically anything that you can think of that could happen to a child that you wouldn't want to happen to your child probably happened to these kids. And most families, even today, still in some way, shape, or form have a historic remembrance of a school of this kind. Some school of this kind. These were operational for a very, very long time. And we wrap up this timeline at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee was a massacre. Here in 1890, December 29th, you can learn a bit more about the 7th Cavalry, which was armed to the kilt, and they attacked Bigfoot's ghost dance encampment on the Pine Ridge Reservation and killed more than 300 men, women, and children. Once again, full families wiped out. Children wiped out. Women wiped out. I think that in a culture of people who we talk about how much we care about kids, we haven't really historically cared about kids very much. We've cared about the right kids. These were not the right kids in their opinion. So they didn't care. They were not nice to these people. They did terrible things and then would blame it on them and mask it through Hollywood by showing that all of the indigenous people are just violent savages. The word savage was clearly associated with Indians in so many ways, but in most places like these, where we actually get to learn about the true culture, most were not violent. They would hunt for resource and for protection only. They wouldn't make it a point to just go and raid most of the time just a random person who was just minding their business. It wasn't the case. So I think it's interesting to come here and see this timeline and to kind of learn about how they started out being able to just peacefully trade. No big deal. Lots of great things came from that. And then it turned into something so violent and ugly, all because we wanted more land. That's usually the case. It is now time for us to move into our final gallery, and this one is called Honor and Celebration. And as we move in, I can already see one of the powwows over here. It mentions here the origin of celebration, that the indigenous dances and music are practiced amongst all tribes in both the United States and Canada. And ceremonies and dances celebrate deity, imitation of nature, tribal warfare, hunting, and also personal experience. And here we can find some of the items that might be used in those ceremonial dances, but also, again, historic photos, including this one from the 1860s, where Northern Plains tribes received the Omaha dance from the Kaw, Omaha, Ponca, and Pawnee of the Southern Plains. This is the bonnet of White Man Run Hymns feather bonnet. In fact, he was a scout for the General George Armstrong Custer during the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, and he survived the battle and later provided a clear account of the events that led to Custer's defeat. Again, we learn about warriors and leaders and something called the men's societies. Men's societies prepared their members for the changing role and responsibilities that they would face throughout life. Again, going back to that community aspect, here we have a variety of different kinds of historic photos, and this one right here I think shows this man in all his regalia. This is Iron Tail on a horse, and this is just summarizing everything that there is to see in this particular case right here. But also they have some other interesting pieces that I definitely encourage you to check out. Touchscreens like these are placed throughout the museum, and you can learn a little bit more about each section. In this one, we're going to go to child naming, and it tells you about how that they would choose the name for a specific child. There are historic photos. There is even an audio section where you can listen to what this says. There are 4 categories here: youth, elder, adult, and of course child, and each one has a few different subjects that allow us to learn more. There is infinite amount of reading here. Over here in this darker corner, there is a display about a sweat lodge, and a sweat lodge is used for ceremonial purposes to cleanse and strengthen the body as well as the mind and the spirit, and it can also be used for healing ceremonies. I appreciate each and every one of you for coming along with me for today's lesson about the Plains Indians. I think that today we learned a lot. We were able to get a lot of brain wrinkles, and places like this are things that you should make time for. Again, this is a huge conglomerate museum. There are so many things that you can take away from this, but I wanted to cover this separately because there is such a deep dive into all of the aspects of the Plains people, and I think that it's absolutely a must if you are in Cody. $23, 2 days admission, lots of stuff to see. Remember guys, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time. Learn from the past, make better tomorrows, and I'll see you next time. Bye. This place was epic.